Big Four International Taxation Interview Preparation, Part 1, Questions 1 to 25. Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're covering international taxation interview prep exactly like Big Four global tax teams expect. These questions reflect real situations you'll face in cross-border structuring, treaty analysis, BEPS alignment, PE exposure, and withholding tax advisory. Let's begin. How do you determine tax residency for multinational entities and individuals under treaty and domestic rules? Sample answer. I begin by applying domestic residency rules, such as POEM for companies and physical presence tests for individuals. If dual residency arises, I apply treaty tiebreaker tests, such as place of effective management, center the vital interests, or habitual abode. My goal is to document substance and ensure alignment with treaty requirements. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. A company operates in multiple jurisdictions. How do you analyze permanent establishment PE exposure? Sample answer. I map activities in each jurisdiction, assess fixed place, service PE, installation PE, and dependent agent indicators. I examine decision-making authority, contract negotiation, and employee presence. If digital operations exist, I also consider SEP and digital nexus rules. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. How do you apply tiebreaker rules for dual resident companies under tax treaties? Sample answer. I evaluate POEM factors, such as board meetings, strategic control, and senior management location. If disputes arise, I use MAP guidance for competent authority resolution. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. A client has a dependent agent in India. How do you evaluate whether it creates a DAPE? Sample answer. I assess whether the agent habitually concludes contracts or plays the principal role in contract finalization. I also test independence factors like economic autonomy and risk assumption. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. How do you interpret business profits articles under OECD UN model conventions? Sample answer. I review whether profits are attributable only when the foreign entity has a PE in India. Then I assess attribution rules such as functions, assets, and risks. Under the UN model, source taxation is typically wider, especially for service PE. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. A foreign company sells digital services into India. How do you evaluate Equalisation Levy and SEP risks? Sample answer. I check whether services fall within the scope of EL 6% or 2%. If outside EL, I test SEP thresholds such as user base, digital interactions, or revenue. I ensure no double taxation between EL and income tax. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. How do you determine appropriate characterization of cross-border transactions? Sample answer. I analyze the nature of rights granted, degree of human involvement, and underlying IP usage to classify as royalty, FTS, or business income. Mischaracterization often drives withholding errors, so documentation is critical. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. A company pays for software licenses. How do you analyze royalty versus copyrighted article treatment? Sample answer. I check whether the license grants rights to reproduce, modify, or exploit the software. If usage is limited to end-user rights, it is typically a copyrighted article, not royalty. Treaty language and judicial precedents are key. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. How do you evaluate applicability of withholding tax under Section 195 for cross-border payments? Sample answer: I examine character of income, apply treaty articles, check beneficial ownership, and determine withholding rate. If income isn't taxable in India, no withholding applies, supported by a reasoned note. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. A taxpayer claims treaty benefits. How do you assess LOB, PPT, and substance requirements? Sample answer: I verify TRC, board minutes, employees, premises, and economic activity. If treaty has PPT or LOB, I test whether one principal purpose of the arrangement is obtaining tax benefits. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. How do you analyze hybrid mismatch situations under BEPS Action 2? Sample answer: I identify deductible, non-inclusion outcomes or double deductions caused by hybrid entities or instruments. Then, I adjust tax positions based on domestic anti-hybrid rules and treaty alignment. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. A client receives offshore support services. How do you determine whether payments constitute FIS, FTS? Sample answer: I analyze whether the service makes available technical knowledge or involves managerial or consultancy elements. If the treaty requires make available, I focus on transfer of capability rather than mere performance. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. How do you evaluate taxability of cloud computing and SaaS? Sample answer: I look at whether the customer receives rights in underlying software or merely access to a platform. If no IP rights transfer, it usually falls under business income, not royalty, unless PE or SEP triggers taxation. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance, and CS. A company has operations in low-tax jurisdictions. How do you assess CFC GILTI anti-avoidance implications? Sample answer: I evaluate whether the jurisdiction meets tax rate thresholds, identify passive income components, and check global minimum tax exposure under Pillar 2. Documentation of substance is essential to avoid challenges. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. How do you identify indirect transfer taxation risk under Section 91I? Sample answer: I test whether shares derive significant value from India-situated assets. If the 50% value threshold is crossed, I analyze exemptions like small shareholder criteria and ensure documentation supports valuation. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. A multinational undergoes restructuring. How do you evaluate cross-border tax implications? Sample answer: I examine capital gains triggers, business connection, withholding obligations, and tax neutrality availability. I ensure restructuring aligns with commercial substance. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. How do you compute foreign tax credits, FTC, and avoid double taxation? Sample answer: I verify foreign taxes paid, map them to corresponding income, apply Rule 128, and ensure credits don't exceed tax payable in India. I also check treaty ordering rules. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. A client has withholding taxes overseas. How do you determine creditability under Indian rules? Sample answer. I check whether tax is covered under the treaty, ensure income is doubly taxed, and verify proof such as tax receipts or assessment documents. Non-creditable taxes require disclosure. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. How do you assess whether a transaction qualifies for treaty relief under Business Profits article? Sample answer. I verify whether the foreign company lacks PE in India and whether the income is appropriately classified as business profits. Documentation must show no dependent agent or fixed place. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. How do you evaluate impact of BEPS 2.0 Pillar 1 and 2 on a global group? Sample answer. I analyze whether the group exceeds revenue thresholds, check reallocations under Amount A, determine top-up tax implications under Pillar 2, and assess entity-level ETR. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. A company has intercompany financing. How do you analyze thin-capitalisation and interest limitation rules? Sample answer. I test Section 94B limits, benchmark interest rates, evaluate debt-to-equity patterns, and assess whether financing aligns with commercial substance. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. How do you determine beneficial ownership for dividends, interest, and royalties? Sample answer. I review control over income, rights to use, obligations to pass through payments, and substance of the receiving entity. Treaty benefits apply only if beneficial ownership conditions are satisfied. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. A client has a foreign branch. How do you evaluate branch versus subsidiary taxation? Sample answer. I compare repatriation tax, foreign tax credit utilization, compliance burden, and PE exposure. Branches are taxed as extensions, while subsidiaries are separate taxable entities. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. How do you analyze tax exposure for offshore digital marketing arrangements? Sample answer. I assess whether payments fall under EL, SEP, royalty, or business income. I review where servers and algorithms are located and whether user data exploitation creates source-based nexus. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. A company has inbound expatriates. How do you evaluate payroll, PE, and Social Security implications? Sample answer. I determine residency, analyze employer-employee relationship, check if secondment creates service PE or DAPE, and verify Social Security treaty applicability. Shadow payroll may also be needed. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. How do you determine attribution of profits to PE under Article 7? Sample answer. I begin by identifying the PE's functions, assets, and risks. I then allocate profits based on the authorized OECD approach, AOA, analyzing internal comparables, capital attribution, and FAR alignment. Documentation must support why only specific profits are attributable. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. A client wants tax structuring for global expansion. How do you design a tax-efficient holding structure? Sample answer. I evaluate treaty networks, dividend, interest, royalty withholding rates, substance requirements, anti-abuse rules, and exit taxation. I also ensure the structure supports commercial substance, governance, and BEPS compliance. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. How do you analyze the impact of MAP, mutual agreement procedure, on ongoing litigation? Sample answer. I assess whether the issue relates to double taxation, review treaty MAP clauses, evaluate timeline and success probability, and suspend parallel litigation where beneficial. MAP is particularly helpful for TP cases. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. A company faces double taxation due to TP adjustment. How do you apply MAP APA? Sample answer. I validate TP positions, quantify double taxation, file MAP with competent authority, and collaborate with both jurisdictions for correlative relief. For future years, APA may provide certainty. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance, ... How do you interpret interplay between domestic law and treaty override provisions? Sample answer. I follow Section 90(2), which allows taxpayers to apply whichever is more beneficial, treaty or domestic law, except in cases like GAAR or Equalisation Levy, where override rules apply. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. A foreign company provides installation services in India. How do you apply service PE rules? Sample answer. I check duration thresholds in the tree, often 183 days, analyze subcontracting arrangements, and confirm whether personnel are present physically or remotely. Documentation must tie activities to the PE threshold. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. How do you analyze BEPS Action 6, treaty abuse, for a complex structure? Sample answer. I evaluate principal purpose, commercial rationale, beneficial ownership, and economic substance. I also confirm LOB PPT compliance to sustain treaty benefits. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. A client receives a TRC. How do you evaluate whether TRC alone is sufficient? Sample answer. A TRC is essential but not conclusive. Treaties often require additional substance, such as beneficial ownership, LOB criteria, and commercial purpose tests. I ensure supporting documentation meets treaty requirements. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. How do you determine source-based taxation for offshore digital transactions? Sample answer. I check SEP thresholds, user-based revenue, digital interaction parameters, and consider equalization levy. If treaty applies, I evaluate PE or royalty characterization carefully. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. A company wants to minimize withholding tax on outbound payments. How do you evaluate treaty shopping risks? Sample answer. I review beneficial ownership, substance in holding entities, and treaty anti-abuse clauses. I advise sustainable structures rather than artificial routing to avoid GAAR exposure. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. How do you analyze recharacterization risk under GAAR for cross-border arrangements? Sample answer. I assess whether the arrangement lacks commercial substance, creates abnormal tax benefit, or uses round-tripping. GAAR may disregard or recharacterize transactions, so substance documentation is key. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. A multinational earns royalty from India. How do you determine taxability and treaty rates? Sample answer. I classify the payment against treaty royalty definitions, verify beneficial ownership, and apply lower treaty withholding if conditions are met. I also analyze whether payment qualifies as FTS instead. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. How do you evaluate cross-border secondment arrangements for FTS PE risk? Sample answer. I check who controls and pays the employee, whether the secondee creates service PE, and whether services involve make-available elements. Substance around employer-employee relationship determines PE impact. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. How do you handle foreign currency and exchange fluctuation rules for tax purposes? Sample answer. I assess Section 43A, ICDS provisions, and whether gains, losses relate to capital or revenue items. I map accounting entries to tax treatment and ensure consistency with treaty positions where relevant. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. A client has multiple foreign subsidiaries. How do you evaluate global minimum tax exposure? Pillar 2. Sample answer. I compute jurisdictional effective tax rates, evaluate qualifying domestic minimum top-up taxes, and identify high-risk, low-tax jurisdictions in the group. I also assess data readiness for GloBE reporting. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. How do you interpret capital gains provisions for share transfers involving foreign entities? Sample answer. I test indirect transfer rules, apply treaty capital gains articles, determine situs of shares, and check grandfathering or exemptions. Documentation on valuation is critical. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. A foreign company sells goods on CIF FOB terms. How do you determine PE and tax implications? Sample answer. I analyze involvement in India, such as marketing support, dependent agent activity, or warehouse usage. CIF terms may create more touchpoints, increasing PE exposure. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. How do you analyze anti-fragmentation rules for splitting of contracts, activities? Sample answer. I assess whether the group splits contracts to avoid PE thresholds, examine related party connections, and evaluate whether combined activities form a cohesive business operation. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. A multinational wants to repatriate profits. How do you evaluate dividend, buyback, or capital reduction? Sample answer. I compare withholding tax under treaties, analyze capital gains exposure, and assess GAAR risks. I choose the option with optimal tax outcome while maintaining substance. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. How do you review tax clauses in cross-border commercial contracts? Sample answer. I verify withholding tax clauses, gross-up provisions, PE avoidance language, indemnity wording, and alignment with treaty characterizations. Contract drafting often determines tax exposure. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. A client receives technical support. How do you determine whether make available applies? Sample answer. I examine if the service enables the recipient to apply technical knowledge independently. If no capability transfer occurs, payments may not qualify as FTS under treaties like India, US. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. How do you analyze offshore e-commerce activities for Indian taxability? Sample answer. I assess SEP triggers, digital user base, server location, and EL applicability. If treaty applies, taxation is limited unless PE or royalty characterization applies. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance, etc. A company enters a royalty-free cost-sharing arrangement. How do you evaluate tax risks? Sample answer. I verify whether contributions reflect actual benefits, check substance of shared activities, and ensure no hidden royalty element. Documentation must support allocation methodology. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. How do you analyze holding companies' substance requirements to sustain treaty benefits? Sample answer. I assess board control, staffing, office presence, economic activity, and financial independence. Shell entities trigger GAAR PPT risks, so substance must be demonstrated. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. How do you present international tax risks and treaty positions to global tax heads CFOs? Sample answer. I summarize PE exposures, withholding gaps, treaty benefits, BEPS risks, and restructuring options in a concise risk matrix. The goal is to give leadership clarity on compliance, opportunities, and documentation requirements. While answering, always talk about treaty protection, PE risk, characterization, documentation, substance. Footnote. Thank you for watching, and if you liked our video, kindly press the like button and leave us a comment. This will help us reach a wider audience. Don't forget to check the playlist for more great learning.